I am Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Doyle, 17 years of federal service. And at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, my own mother-in-law told me to get out of a house I paid the mortgage on. If you're watching this from a base, a barracks, or a kitchen table, where nobody believes what you actually did for a living, comment your duty station below. Then like and subscribe before this gets worse, because it does. 3 things were happening to me at once that afternoon, and I didn't understand any of them yet. The first was a folder, a sealed manila envelope with a red classification strip that had been sitting in my husband's home office safe for 6 weeks. A folder he thought I'd never see, containing a paternity lab request he'd filed without my consent, and a second document he hadn't bothered to read all the way through. The second was a marriage that had been dead for longer than I wanted to admit. Dead since the night Todd found out I'd been recommended for battalion command, and laughed, actually laughed, and said someone had to be joking. The third was a truth about who I really was at Bragg for 6 of the last 8 years. A truth classified under a program most people in that living room couldn't spell. A truth that was about to walk through their front door in dress blues, whether they were ready for it or not. My daughter Emma was 11 months old, asleep against my shoulder, milk-drunk and smelling like the strawberry lotion I put on her after every bath. I had no idea that by 6 o'clock that evening, a retired 2-star general would be standing in that same living room, reading a document out loud that would end my mother-in-law's version of reality forever. Todd and I met at a mutual friend's wedding in Fayetteville 9 years ago, back when I was a captain and he was selling commercial real estate and telling everyone at the table I was, in his words, in logistics, paperwork mostly. I let it slide the first time, because I'd just come off a deployment and didn't have the energy to correct a stranger at an open bar. I did not let it slide the 40th time, 3 years into our marriage, when he told his golf partners the same line, while I stood there in my Class A uniform with a Bronze Star ribbon on my chest, that he had literally helped me pin on that morning. He knew, he always knew. He just preferred the version of me that made him comfortable. The wife who filed things and typed things and definitely did not outrank half the men at his country club. My real work, the work I couldn't discuss at dinner parties or golf outings, involved something called Task Force Sabre Ridge, a joint interagency logistics and personnel recovery cell operating out of a nondescript building at Bragg that didn't have a sign on the door. I coordinated extraction logistics for downed personnel across 3 theaters. I briefed 1-star and 2-star generals twice a week. I had a security clearance that took federal investigators 14 months and 40 interviews with neighbors and former roommates to grant. Todd told his mother I answered phones for the Army. His mother, Diane Doyle, a former real estate agent who'd never worked a W-2 job past 1994, repeated that phrase so often at family dinners that Emma's own pediatrician once asked me, with genuine concern in her voice, whether I found clerical work fulfilling. I stopped correcting people around year 5, not because I'd given up, but because I'd learned something in that windowless building at Bragg that most people never learn. The ones who need to know already know, and the ones who don't need to know will believe whatever lets them sleep at night. General Marcus Whitfield knew. My clearance investigators knew. The 11 soldiers I helped bring home in the back of a C-130 during a mission I still can't fully discuss knew. Todd's book club did not need to know, and for 5 years I let that be enough. What changed was the deployment cycle. In March, 6 weeks before Emma's first birthday, Task Force Sabre Ridge received activation orders for a rotation I couldn't decline, a 90-day window that would put me overseas for the second half of my daughter's 2nd year of life. I told Todd on a Sunday morning over coffee. He didn't yell. He didn't even really react. He just set down his mug, looked at me for a long moment and said, "You know most women would choose their family." I remember the exact weight of that sentence, the way it landed on the kitchen counter between us like something breakable. I had chosen my family every single day for 17 years. I had simply also chosen to defend it, in a way he refused to see as a choice at all. 6 days before I deployed, I noticed the safe in Todd's home office had been opened and closed by someone who didn't know I'd memorized the sound of its particular click. A half-second hesitation before the bolt released, that only happened when the combination was entered too fast by unfamiliar fingers. I said nothing. I finished packing my sea bag, kissed Emma's forehead in her crib, 40 times more than necessary, and left for a 90-day rotation that turned into 111 days after a mission extension nobody could explain to me over an unsecured line. I came home to a house that smelled like someone else's cologne in the guest bathroom, and a husband who wouldn't quite meet my eyes at the airport gate. I didn't ask about the cologne right away. I'm trained not to move on incomplete information, and 11 years of intelligence work teaches you that the person who asks the obvious question too early gives away that they're already building a case. So I waited. I watched. And 3 weeks after I got home, I found the envelope, not by searching, but by accident, tucked behind a stack of old insurance paperwork I was reorganizing in that same office safe, whose combination I had never actually changed, because some part of me, some professionally paranoid part of me, wanted to know what he thought he was hiding. Inside was a private paternity testing kit receipt from a lab in Charlotte, dated 11 days after I'd left for deployment, a full 2 months before I came home. Attached to it was a printed email exchange between Todd and his mother, Diane, with a subject line that read simply, "When Rachel gets back." In it, Diane had written the sentence I would hear her say out loud to my face, 4 months later, word for word, like she'd rehearsed it. She was never really a soldier, honey. She just processes paperwork. She won't fight you on any of this. I photographed both documents with my personal phone, backed them up to a secure cloud drive I'd used since my first deployment, and put the originals back exactly where I found them, down to the half-inch gap between the receipt and the insurance folder. Whatever this was building toward, I was not going to be the one who tipped my hand first. The pediatric records were the second piece. Emma had been born via a documented, witnessed, on-post delivery at Womack Army Medical Center, with Todd present in the room, holding my hand through 11 hours of labor, cutting the cord himself, while a lame Army nurse named Sergeant Alvarez recorded time of birth at 3:47 a.m. There was no scenario in which paternity was a real medical question. This wasn't about biology. I understood that clearly, standing in that office with my thumb hovering over the photograph I'd just taken. This was about control, about a man who could not tolerate being married to someone whose file outranked his ego, manufacturing a crisis he could survive by making me the villain in it. I filed the documents away in my mind, the same way I'd file a threat assessment, and I kept living my life exactly as I had before, because the worst thing I could do was let him see me flinch. Diane Doyle had perfected a very specific kind of cruelty over the years, the kind that never raises its voice, the kind that smiles while it cuts. At Easter that year, with Emma barely toddling across her grandmother's living room carpet, Diane leaned toward her sister-in-law and said, just loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen doorway, "It's a shame Rachel's away so much. Some women just aren't built for that sacrifice. You know, staying home." I was standing 8 feet away holding a casserole dish I'd made from scratch at 11 o'clock the night before, after a 12-hour shift, because I refused to let anyone say I didn't try. Diane never once asked what my actual job entailed. In 9 years, she asked me exactly 0 questions about Task Force Sabre Ridge, 0 questions about my Bronze Star, 0 questions about the 11 names of soldiers I'd helped recover, whose families sent me a Christmas card every single year. She had already decided who I was in the first 6 months of dating her son, and no amount of promotion, no amount of ribbon, no amount of 11-hour labor at Womack Army Medical Center was going to move that decision an inch. The second time it surfaced was at Todd's law office holiday party in December, where I met Amanda Kessler for the first time, a paralegal, 12 years younger than me, who worked directly under Todd's firm's managing partner, and who, I would later learn, had been the source of the cologne in my guest bathroom. Amanda had a habit of tilting her head slightly when she spoke to me, a small performative pity, and that night she said, "Apropos of nothing, Todd says you travel constantly for administrative stuff? That must be so hard on Emma." I told her, evenly, that I'd missed 6 of Emma's first 12 months defending federal interests overseas, and that Emma was, in fact, thriving. Thank you for asking. Amanda blinked twice and changed the subject to a boutique hotel in Charleston. I filed that exchange away too. The third antagonist entered the picture formally in February, 4 months before Emma's first birthday, when Todd retained a divorce attorney named Gregory Pruitt, a man with a reputation in Cumberland County for aggressive theatrical courtroom tactics and a habit of treating military spouses as though their service records were props rather than sworn federal documents. Pruitt called me directly once, against every rule of professional conduct, to inform me that his client intended to challenge both custody and what he called the validity of certain paternal assumptions, and that I would be wise to accept a settlement before things became, in his phrase, unnecessarily public. I recorded that call, as I am legally permitted to do in North Carolina, on a device I have carried on every deployment since 2019. Pruitt did not know that. Pruitt did not know a great many things about the woman he was threatening. If you've ever had someone rewrite your sacrifice into a punchline at their own dinner table, hit like right now and subscribe, because the next part is the moment I stopped being patient. Emma's first birthday party was scheduled for a Saturday in May. At the house Todd and I still shared, though we'd been sleeping in separate rooms for 2 months by then. Todd texted me that morning, "Don't be late today. Mum has a big surprise planned." I remember reading it twice in the parking lot at the base clinic, where I'd taken Emma for a scheduled checkup, and feeling something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with intelligence training, and everything to do with 9 years of learning to read between his lines. I strapped Emma into her car seat, checked my rearview mirror out of a habit I couldn't unlearn if I tried, and drove the 14 minutes home telling myself it was nothing. It was just Diane wanting a bigger cake than we'd budgeted for. It was not the cake. When I opened the front door at exactly 4:15 p.m., the living room was full. 20-some relatives packed shoulder to shoulder around a banner that read "Happy Birthday, Emma," in gold foil letters that Diane had clearly paid too much for. Every single face turned toward me at once, and not one of them was smiling. Todd was standing by the fireplace, holding a manila folder I recognized instantly. The same folder, the same red strip, though he'd clearly added pages to it since I last saw it in the safe. He walked toward me, and in front of his mother, his sister, his uncle from Wilmington, and Amanda Kessler, standing suspiciously close to the kitchen doorway, in a dress that cost more than my monthly housing allowance. He slapped the folder down on the entryway table and said, "This isn't my daughter Rachel. I got it tested." Diane stepped forward before I could even process the sentence, gesturing toward the open door behind me, toward the driveway, toward the life I had built. "You need to leave. This is still my son's house. Get out." Emma, still in my arms, started to cry, startled by the volume, by the crowd, by 20 adults staring at her mother like she was a stranger caught, trespassing in her own home. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because everyone in that room was waiting for me to cry, needed me to cry, so the story they'd already written about the paperwork wife would make sense. The living room smelled like the vanilla candle Diane always brought as a hostess gift, and underneath it, like the bakery frosting on a cake I hadn't even seen yet. And I remember focusing on that smell, on the exact temperature of Emma's small hand fisted in the collar of my shirt, because it gave me one steady thing to hold on to, while 20 pairs of eyes waited for me to break. I looked at Todd, at the folder, at Diane's outstretched arm, pointing toward the door, and I said one sentence, flat and quiet. "Before you say anything else in front of your family, Todd, I'd think very carefully about what's actually in that folder, and whether you read all of it." Nobody in that room understood what I meant, but behind me, through the open front door I'd just walked through, I heard a second car door close in the driveway, and heavy, deliberate footsteps starting up the front walk. The footsteps belonged to retired Major General Marcus Whitfield, 61 years old, 3 tours, the officer who had signed off on my clearance renewal 8 months earlier, and who I'd called from the base clinic parking lot the moment I read Todd's text that morning, some instinct in me finally deciding that patience had run its course. General Whitfield did not knock. He walked into that living room in a plain grey suit, no uniform, no announcement, and set his own folder down on the entryway table beside Todd's, close enough that the two folders touched. "Which one of you is Todd Doyle?" he said, and his voice filled the room the way command voices do, without needing volume to do it. Todd, to his credit or his cowardice, actually raised his hand like he was in grade school. Diane's outstretched arm, still pointed at the front door, slowly lowered itself back to her side. Whitfield opened his folder and began reading from a single sheet of paper, a formal statement he'd had notarized that morning after my 3 a.m. phone call, though he didn't tell them that part yet. He read Emma's actual birth record from Womack Army Medical Center. Time of birth, 3:47 a.m. Attending physician, Captain Reyes. Witness delivery. Father listed and present at cord cutting, Todd Andrew Doyle. He read it slowly, letting every syllable land, and I watched Todd's face go the color of the drywall behind him. Then Whitfield set that page aside and picked up a second document, a formal letter on Department of Defense letterhead, and said, "Now, since apparently nobody in this room has ever bothered to ask Lieutenant Colonel Doyle what she actually does for a living, I'm going to read you her most recent performance evaluation, because I signed it myself in March." He read from it for nearly 4 minutes. He read about Task Force Sabre Ridge, about 11 personnel recovery operations across 3 theaters, about a Bronze Star citation for actions during an extraction mission in a location he was still not permitted to name aloud in a civilian living room, about a security clearance investigation that took federal agents 14 months to complete because of the sensitivity of the program I'd been running. He read the line, verbatim, from my most recent OER. "Lieutenant Colonel Doyle's judgment under pressure has directly preserved American lives on multiple occasions and reflects the finest traditions of the officer corps." Diane's face had gone from smug to grey to something closer to nausea. Amanda Kessler had quietly backed herself into the kitchen doorway, as though the drywall might swallow her. And Todd just stood there holding a paternity folder that had already been rendered meaningless, staring at a general reading his wife's actual life back to a room that had spent 9 years calling it paperwork. "She was never really a soldier," Whitfield said, closing the folder, repeating back to the room the exact sentence Diane had written in that email. The sentence I'd photographed and backed up 11 months earlier. The sentence I never told him she'd said, but that he somehow knew anyway, because I'd sent him the documents the week before, quietly, through channels, in case I ever needed a witness who couldn't be dismissed. "She just processes paperwork, and she won't fight you on any of this." That's a direct quote, Mrs. Doyle. Would you like to explain to your granddaughter, when she's older, exactly what her grandmother meant by that? Nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute, though it was probably closer to 8 seconds, the kind of silence that has weight and texture, that presses against your eardrums. Emma had stopped crying and was watching the room with the wide, curious eyes of a child who doesn't understand the words, but understands completely that the balance of power in a room has just shifted. I finally broke the silence myself, walking past Todd to set my daughter's diaper bag down on the console table, like this was any other Saturday, like a retired 2-star general hadn't just detonated 9 years of quiet condescension in under 5 minutes. "I'm going to put Emma down for her nap," I said. "Todd, I'll expect you to withdraw whatever filing your attorney has prepared by Monday morning, or General Whitfield has offered to provide a formal deposition to the court instead. Your choice." That was not, however, the end of it, because Gregory Pruitt was not a man who backed down simply because his client's mother had been publicly humiliated in a living room. 3 weeks later, I received formal notice that Todd was proceeding with the divorce filing anyway, and that Pruitt intended to argue, in a Cumberland County family court, that my military service constituted a pattern of chronic absence, disqualifying me from primary custody of Emma, and that the paternity question, though resolved by hospital record, still cast what he called reasonable doubt on the emotional stability of the household. I remember reading the filing in my kitchen at 11 at night, Emma finally asleep upstairs, and feeling something in me go very cold and very still. The the same stillness I used to feel in the seconds before a mission briefing, when the adrenaline hasn't hit yet, but you already know exactly what has to happen next. I called my attorney the following morning, a woman named Colonel Renata Ford, retired, JAG Corps, 22 years of active service, who had transitioned into private family law practice, specifically because she'd watched too many military spouses, mostly women, get outmaneuvered in civilian courtrooms by attorneys who understood custody law, but understood nothing about the Service Members' Civil Relief Act, nothing about how deployment orders function as sworn federal documents, nothing about how a security clearance investigation is, functionally, the most thorough background check a human being can undergo short of a criminal trial. Ford had represented 11 military spouses in the past 6 years, and had lost exactly 0 custody cases. She read Pruitt's filing twice, set it down on her desk, and said, "This is going to be embarrassing for him. Are you ready for that?" I told her I had been ready for 4 months. She told me, in that case, we would need 3 additional documents before the hearing. My complete personnel file with dates cross-referenced against every claim in Pruitt's filing. A sworn statement from General Whitfield formalizing what he'd said in that living room. And, if I could get it, financial records establishing exactly how much of the household's actual income over the past 6 years had come from my combat and hazard duty pay rather than Todd's real estate commissions, which had declined every year since 2021. The financial piece turned out to be the sharpest blade in the whole case, sharper even than the paternity humiliation. Ford's paralegal pulled 6 years of joint tax filings and found that my base pay, hazard duty incentive pay, and combat zone tax exclusion income had covered 71% of the household's total earnings since Emma's conception. A fact Todd had never once acknowledged. Not at dinner parties, not to his mother, not even, I suspect, fully to himself. Ford also discovered something Pruitt clearly hadn't anticipated us finding. A series of wire transfers totaling $43,000 moved from a joint investment account into a separate account under Todd's name alone, beginning the same month he'd ordered that private paternity test, money that included funds from my last re-enlistment bonus. Ford called it exactly what it was in her filing: concealment of marital assets in contemplation of divorce, a claim that carries real weight in North Carolina family court, and that Pruitt, for all his theatrical instincts, had apparently never told his own client to prepare for. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in the Cumberland County Family Courthouse, Courtroom 4B, a room with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill, and wooden benches worn smooth by 2 decades of other people's worst days. I wore my Class A uniform, not for theater, but because Ford had advised it plainly. Let the record see exactly who is sitting across from Gregory Pruitt. I pinned every ribbon myself that morning at 5:40 a.m., counted them twice out of old habit, the bronze star catching the bathroom light for a half second before I smoothed my jacket flat. The gallery filled faster than I expected. Diane sat in the second row, in pearls, refusing to look at me. Amanda Kessler sat beside Todd's sister, 3 rows back, dressed like she was attending a gallery opening rather than watching a marriage end. And along the back wall, in a row I hadn't arranged and didn't expect, sat 6 people in varying states of civilian and dress uniform: General Whitfield, 2 former Sabre Ridge teammates who'd driven 4 hours from Bragg on their own time, and 3 spouses from the Fort Bragg Family Readiness Group, who'd heard, through channels I still don't fully understand, exactly what kind of hearing this was. Judge Patricia Alvarez, a 20-year veteran of the family court bench, with a reputation for moving quickly and tolerating no theater from either side, called the case at 9:02 a.m. Pruitt opened with his chronic absence argument, citing my deployment record as evidence of what he called an inherently unstable domestic environment, and for 11 minutes he built a narrative in which every combat tour I'd served was recast as abandonment, every classified assignment as evasiveness, every promotion as evidence I'd chosen career over family. He was good at it, I'll give him that. He had clearly rehearsed the cadence, the pauses, the practiced disappointment in his voice, when he said the words, 11 months away from her infant daughter, in a single 18-month period. Todd sat beside him, nodding slightly, and Diane, 3 rows back, allowed herself the smallest, tightest smile. Then Ford stood up and, instead of arguing, asked the court's permission to call General Marcus Whitfield to the stand as an expert witness on military service records and readiness deployment protocols. Pruitt objected, weakly, on relevance grounds, and Judge Alvarez overruled him in under 10 seconds. Whitfield took the stand in full dress uniform this time, 2 stars catching the fluorescent light, and for the next 18 minutes, he walked the court through exactly what Task Force Sabre Ridge did, what a personnel recovery operation entails, what a Bronze Star citation for actions under fire actually requires, and, critically, that every single deployment on my record had been a lawful order under federal authority, not a personal choice available for renegotiation, protected explicitly under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. He read my most recent evaluation into the record, the same one from the living room, and this time nobody in the gallery whispered. He then produced the sworn statement Ford had requested, formally entering into evidence the email Diane Doyle had written 11 months earlier, the one that said Rachel was never really a soldier, just processed paperwork, and wouldn't fight any of this. Judge Alvarez read the email herself, silently, for almost a full minute, the only sound in the courtroom, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint scrape of General Whitfield's chair as he shifted his weight in the witness box, and, from somewhere in the gallery, the small squeak of a spouse's hand tightening around a paper coffee cup. Then she looked up, first at Diane, who would not meet her eyes, and then directly at me. "Lieutenant Colonel Doyle," she said, "for the record, and for the benefit of everyone in this gallery, would you describe, to whatever extent your clearance allows, what actual leadership responsibility looks like within Task Force Sabre Ridge?" It was not a question Pruitt could object to. It was not a question Todd could spin. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and answered plainly, the way I would brief any commander, describing chain of command, describing the 11 soldiers whose names I still carry, describing what it costs a person to be trusted, with decisions that determine whether another human being comes home. When I finished, Judge Alvarez turned to the paternity claim next, entered the Womack Army Medical Center birth record into evidence without ceremony, noted for the transcript that the petitioner's own signature appeared on the birth certificate as witnessing father, and then addressed Todd directly. "Mr. Doyle, I want to be very clear with you before I rule. The court does not take kindly to paternity claims filed for leverage rather than genuine belief, particularly when hospital records directly contradict the claim. Do you understand the weight of what you filed?" Todd, for the first time in 9 years that I had witnessed, had absolutely nothing to say. Ford then moved to the financial concealment, walking the court through the $43,000 in transfers, the timeline matching precisely with the paternity test order, and Judge Alvarez's expression shifted from measured neutrality into something closer to controlled anger, the specific anger of a judge who has seen this particular maneuver 100 times and has never once found it acceptable. She ruled from the bench rather than taking it under advisement, an unusual move Ford told me afterward happens in maybe 1 hearing out of 30. Primary physical custody to me, with generous, standard visitation for Todd. The concealed funds ordered, returned to the marital estate, and split according to the 71% income contribution, documented in 6 years of tax filings. And, in a line I will remember for the rest of my life, Judge Alvarez looked directly at Diane Doyle in the gallery and said, "I'd also note for the record that grandparents do not have standing to remove a service member from her own home, and any party who attempts to do so again should expect this court to take a very dim view of it." Diane stood up and walked out of the courtroom before the judge had finished the sentence, her heels loud against the tile, and nobody in that gallery, not even Todd, moved to follow her. 6 months passed before I could walk through my own front door without bracing for something. Emma turned 2 in a small backyard party I planned myself. No banners from Diane, just balloons, a homemade cake, slightly lopsided from being frosted one-handed while she napped, and General Whitfield showing up unannounced with a stuffed army mascot dog that was almost bigger than she was, insisting he'd simply been in the area, which we both knew wasn't true, and neither of us said out loud, the two of us standing at the edge of the yard while Emma dragged that stuffed dog nearly twice her size across the grass. The late afternoon light turning the whole backyard the color of weak tea, and for the first time in over a year, I felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't fully realized was still clenched. Diane Doyle's consequences arrived slowly, and then all at once. Word travels fast in a country club, and the story of a two-star general publicly correcting her in front of 20 relatives, followed by a judge scolding her from the bench, followed the church social circuit within a matter of weeks. She was quietly asked to step down from the Women's Auxiliary Board she'd chaired for 6 years. Her Christmas card list, by Todd's own admission months later, shrank considerably. She has not, as of this recording, apologized to me directly, though she did send Emma a birthday card in the mail, unsigned, which I choose to interpret as the closest thing to an admission she's capable of. Amanda Kessler was quietly let go from Todd's law firm 4 months after the hearing, following an internal review that determined her relationship with a client's spouse, conducted partly during business hours, violated firm policy in ways the managing partner found impossible to overlook once it became public record in a courtroom transcript. Gregory Pruitt, I'm told by Ford, still practices in Cumberland County, though 2 other JAG-affiliated family attorneys have mentioned to her that judges in that courthouse now scrutinize his filings involving military spouses considerably more closely than they once did, a professional cost that will likely follow him for years, the kind of reputational damage that doesn't show up on a resume, but shows up in every case he loses that he shouldn't have. Todd is the one whose ending surprised me most. 8 months after the hearing, on a Tuesday when he came to pick up Emma for his scheduled weekend, he stood on my porch for a long moment before speaking, turning his car keys over in his hand the way he used to when he was working up to something difficult. I read your full file, he said. Ford sent it over as part of discovery. All of it. The parts I was cleared to see anyway. I didn't know about the extraction in 2021. I didn't know about the letter from that soldier's mother, the one you kept in your desk drawer. I told him I knew he didn't know, because he'd never once asked. He nodded, looked past me into the house where Emma was watching cartoons on the living room floor, and said the only genuinely honest sentence I'd heard from him in over a year. I think I was always a little afraid of you, and it was easier to make you small than to admit that. I didn't forgive him that day. Not fully. Not in any way that erased 4 months of humiliation staged in my own living room. But I told him he could still be a good father to Emma, even if he'd been a coward as a husband, and that those were 2 different debts, and only one of them was still open for repayment. We are, nearly a year later, something that functions like careful civility, co-parenting with schedules and shared calendars, and the occasional stiff but polite exchange at pickup, and for Emma's sake, I've decided that's enough. I think about that living room often, the 20 faces turned toward me, the folder on the entryway table, the way an entire family had spent 9 years deciding who I was, without once asking me directly. I think about how many women in uniform, in scrubs, in boardrooms, in kitchens, are carrying entire lives nobody around them has bothered to ask about, reduced to a smaller, more manageable version of themselves, because the truth would require other people to reckon with their own smallness. I was never just paperwork. I was never just a secretary answering phones. I was a lieutenant colonel who brought 11 soldiers home, who built a career in rooms most of my own family will never be cleared to enter, and who still came home every single time to make dinner, and read bedtime stories, and pin ribbons on a uniform nobody in that living room had ever bothered to really look at. So I'll ask you the same question I've been asking myself since that Thursday morning in courtroom 4B. How many people in your own life have you quietly underestimated, simply because it was easier than asking them who they really are? There's one more thing I never told you about that folder Todd slapped down on the entryway table. One detail Ford found buried in the lab paperwork weeks after the hearing was already over. Something about the chain of custody on that paternity sample that raises a question none of us have fully answered yet, and it's the reason my next conversation with Todd's attorney is scheduled for next month, instead of being closed for good. I'll tell you exactly what that detail was in the next video, because if you've made it this far, sat through every reveal in that courtroom with me, you've already proven you care how this actually ends. So do the one small thing that costs you nothing and means everything to a channel like this. Hit subscribe right now, before you lose this page, so you don't miss it.